Hello everyone and welcome to another UC Today panel discussion. I'm Rob Scott and today we'll be talking about migrating from Skype for Business to Microsoft's latest collaboration and cloud calling platform, Teams. So today I'm joined by a panel of Microsoft UC experts. I'll start by handing over to each speaker for a quick intro, but let's start with Mark. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Mark Vale. I am an independent Microsoft Teams consultant. I've been working in the Microsoft space now for over 10 years. Done many global deployments in Lincoln Skype for Business and now into Teams direct routing. I'm the founder of the Microsoft Teams conference Commsverse in April, so if you head on over to our website at commsverse.com, check it out. If that appeals to you, I'll see you there.
Great, thanks. And Randy?
Hi, Randy Chapman here, Microsoft MVP, recent awardee, blogger at ucstatus.com. I've been a Microsoft consultant for, I suppose, about 20 years now, working with Link and Skype for Business and now Teams, I guess, for the last 10 or 12 years. I did a lot of deployment back in the day, now more of an architect and consultant for a company called Enable It. I'm also one of the core organizers for Commsverse. With Mark Vale. Good to see you.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks for joining us. And finally, Shawn.
Yeah, hi guys. So thanks for having me, Rob. Shawn Harry, independent consultant as well. I've been in the Microsoft UCC space for just over 20 years now, as I mentioned earlier, going back to the heady days of Exchange 5.5. I've come along with the evolution of the product from the early days of LCS, right up until Teams. Most of my work is pretty much in the enterprise space. Done a lot of work for investment banks in the insurance and auditing space, with a predominant sort of focus around the cloud, so Azure as well as AWS, in fact, but also enterprise voice and all the components that go along with that for Teams.
Fantastic. So welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to this one. So Microsoft Teams, we all know its success so far in the marketplace. But there is a legacy. That legacy is Microsoft Skype for Business, certainly on server, not so much online, but there's still a huge legacy out there. And today's session, I wanted to really discuss, how to get from the Microsoft's Skype for Business solution onto Teams, and kind of consult the experts on, maybe the challenges and the pitfalls, and maybe the tactics that organizations can take to move successfully and smoothly, ultimately, to Microsoft Teams. So, first of all, Mark, I'd like to start with yourself. I've got Microsoft Skype for Business. How do I get to Teams? What the options? What maybe the scenarios to consider?
Well, I think before you make the jump to Teams, you've got to consider that Teams is a completely different beast to what Skype for Business has been up to now. So with Skype for Business, we're used to having instant messaging, meetings and voice. In Teams, we have this added ingredient of collaboration as well. So a lot of enterprises, a lot of businesses now have to consider what they do in the collaboration space first, with like document management, how teams interact and what have you. And it's a real change of culture to what we're used to. So before we start talking about getting from Skype to Teams, we really need to decide what we're doing with that collaboration element. Are we turning it off to all intents and purposes and going with a more UC-centric focus, or are we going to tackle the collaboration piece first while retaining my UC capability on Skype for Business for a short period of time? Once we've nailed the collaboration space, we start thinking about moving meetings across, and then more complex scenarios such as voice. But for the next 12 months at least, if not longer, there is going to be this period of coexistence between Skype and Teams as you move your simple use case users across to Teams and leave your most complex users on-prem until you have like contact center, or you can tackle your analog gateways or what have you. So the answer to the question is rather complex, and it depends on how your business, or how complex your business is. If it's a simple business, it's easy to move across, or relatively. If it's more complex, like in investment banking, what have you, then that journey's going to take a little bit longer. But essentially, you can move to Teams using a number of different tactics. We have this concept of modes where you can configure the Teams client to a certain set of features and interop with Skype for Business. So the basic one, like I spoke about, is collaboration only. So you retain your instant messaging, chat, meetings, and voice in Skype for Business, and you can then use the team functionality in Teams to work on that collaboration piece. Then we have a different mode called Skype for Business, or Teams with, was it Skype for Business with Teams collaboration and meetings.
Yeah.
And that allows you to move your meeting spaces across, but you really need to then consider what you're doing with your meeting rooms. You know, do you have interrupt, or do you require video interrupt between your legacy meeting rooms, or do you need to spend some more cash on certified Teams meeting room devices to make that jump? And then let's just assume that you've made that jump in whatever scenario works for you. You then can tackle voice, and that will then go to Teams only mode, and you have the option of using calling plans in the cloud, direct routing, whether that's an on-prem SBC, using your existing SBCs that are certified for Skype for Business. You can use majority of them with Teams, or you're going to look to more of a hosted direct routing model where you go to your telco provider and they provide you the SBC as a service and call packages in charge of that. So everything basically is hosted in the cloud, and you become a cloud voice only organization.
It sounds like Microsoft have covered this off in terms of all scenarios, no matter where or what situation the organization's in, large or small. There is a path to Microsoft Teams, but it sounds complex. It sounds like you're going to need help. You know, Randy, have you got anything to add there? I mean, I know you're heavily involved in architecting these kinds of migration plans. Anything to add from your side?
Yeah, I mean the one thing to add there is that there's different paths for Skype for Business. So there's Skype for Business Online, which is Microsoft's kind of watered down, they probably won't like me saying that, version of the solution as a multi-tenanted cloud-based thing. When Microsoft announced that was going, or Skype for Business was going, what they actually meant was Skype for Business Online. So the servers that make up that architecture are actually being retired, and all those functionality and features are going to move to Teams. So Skype for Business Server, is still something that's going to live on. That's the kind of legacy. Started off in MSN, like an on-prem MSN in Exchange back in 2000. Then it was LCS, OCS, Link, and now Skype for Business. So I actually don't see that Skype for Business Server going away for a while. There's going to be a lot of cloud-averse people, cloud-averse organizations that just don't trust the cloud. There's also, right now there's things like interoperability and integration with Skype for Business, so contact center and recording and those kind of things. Those things are coming, but it'll be like a version 1 probably either later this year or early next year. So the things you have to consider is, when you're replacing one system with another, any system with another system is all the dependencies. So Mark touched on things like analog gateways. You got to consider where your lines and your numbers are. You got things like lift phones, fax machines, even for organizations that still use those. Concierge desks. Do you have a gatehouse that needs to be involved in call flows and things like that? And you've got to think about all the different scenarios. Even things like wireless handsets. There's no wireless handsets right now that support Teams. Although there are some coming, but with interop with gateways and things. So the architecture can be quite complex. And you asked a second ago, is it complex and do you need help? The answer is yes, unless you employ a UC expert such as Mark or Shawn to actually help you with all this. You need the help of a partner. And there's not many that can do the whole piece, so it's really vital that you speak to the right people, or go out to the market and go for sort of self-employed contractor experts like Shawn and Mark there. So yeah, there are a lot of moving pieces and a lot of parts, but it's all doable. Everything as far as I've seen in even the most complex things, 90% of the stuff that you need to do in Teams is doable, with some sort of interop, some sort of gateway, maybe even some programming or application development or something like that. You can do it. There's a lot to it, and there's a lot of planning involved.
And I imagine the users and as well as the business want as little disruption on that migration path as possible. They want that added functionality, but equally they want a pretty smooth transition to Teams. So Shawn, over to you. In terms of that experience, what do you see from your perspective? Do organizations lose functionality? Are they disruptive? Is disrupted in some in a way as part of that process?
Yeah, I mean, disruption is something that you always want to try and keep to an absolute minimum. You obviously want to reduce that friction, as part of the migration. I think that the key is, I think with Teams is really just the planning. There is a significant amount of planning that does need to be done, because there's obviously a huge amount of transform, within the product itself. Getting used to a whole new platform, like Mark mentioned earlier. Skype for Business is vastly different to Teams. Teams obviously is an extensible application. It can do a lot more. It can obviously transform your workloads, your workflows. There's obviously a lot of integration that is possible with the platform for things like video and baking in other third-party applications as well. I think where Teams really sort of excels is really around the collaboration aspect. Collaboration tends to be, I think, in my opinion, the easier workload to deploy first, because that's really obviously the core part of Teams, and then you really build on top of that, around that. So the transform and the planning, the adoption, the business change, the change management, making sure you've got champions as well, that can evangelize throughout the business. That I think is definitely a key factor in getting people on board, getting the business on board, making sure that you've got that exec buy-in at the very top level. Obviously, that then filters down, get people onto the product as quickly as possible. So that essentially, you've got your IT champions effectively dog fooding the product, I guess, for you, providing that feedback as well. That's all very, very important. Understanding what your success criteria is going to be, because that rollout will need to be staggered. And obviously, at the point that you've got significant feedback, you can get into a good level of velocity, I suppose, with your migrations as well, depending on what workloads you need to deploy, what your use cases are, and that's all that planning that needs to happen, really at the beginning of the project, and up front, before you actually really start sort of cranking the handle in anger.
Great stuff. Now, in terms of functionality, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that Skype for Business Server is a really functional PBX platform, phone system, but Microsoft Teams not quite got the capabilities that Skype for Business Server had. So does that mean, for some organizations, a hybrid kind of solution might be the better way to go for the time being? And how do you handle that? Yeah,
so it's an interesting one, because like you said, the Teams as an ecosystem, I suppose, essentially it's not as mature as, I guess, Skype for Business Server. Obviously, Skype for Business Server, Link, and so on has got effectively 15, 20 years worth of legacy, right? So we've got a mature ecosystem. Teams is still quite nascent. It's obviously still being built. But the good thing is Microsoft, and you'll see the announcement at Ignite and also on the roadmap, a lot of the, as I like to call them, I don't really want to call them edge use cases, but they're not sort of core use cases, as it were. But the edge use cases around voice are being addressed. So things like, compliance, if you have a requirement there, certainly in the IB space, that's obviously quite important. Some of the other features as well, they immediately don't come to mind, but essentially Microsoft are addressing a lot of those issues, which is a good thing. So you do have to be aware of obviously what's on the roadmap, what's coming, make sure that you're doing that planning, you're doing that intelligence gathering, you're working with third-party vendors and so on to make sure that you can obviously meet your use cases. So Teams is getting there. I think for the majority of use cases, like Mark said earlier, 90% of use cases obviously would be satisfied. It's things around the edges like contact center, maybe attendant console and so on, and that might be a little bit difficult now. But like I said, those gaps are being bridged, and there is some good stuff in the roadmap and in the pipeline.
And we've got a roadmap, haven't we? Developed really, really fast over the past 2 years. But it sounds like there's not really a finishing line there. If you're going to move to Teams, you might as well move, because there's still going to be work done. As you say, it's not ever going to be 100% perfect. But Mark, anything to add there around that kind of hybrid journey?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, if you compare like the core features with Skype for Business Enterprise Voice with Teams, it's about it's there or thereabouts. What Shawn's alluding to and what a lot of people are saying is not parity with Skype for Business is the fact that with Skype, you have this function of you can integrate with analog from the server. You can have trusted applications, so you can extend Skype for Business into third-party applications. And those sorts of pieces are missing from Teams right now, basically because we go into the cloud. Microsoft need to design an API to allow vendors to interop with their calling stack to make that happen. So all that takes time. So those are the complex scenarios that potentially hybrid still fixes or solves the problem for. When you look at organizations of the several thousands of users, they're going to have a lot of complexity in there. As we've sort of mentioned, we have analog, we have lift phones, we have door access systems, we have logistic goods inwards and what have you. We also have users who aren't tied to a PC or mobile device. We have manufacturing lines and what have you. Those types of organizations are going to benefit from a hybrid system, even if that is going to be a certain percentage Teams voice and the other percentage is going to be another PBX system. There is going to be a period of hybrid for at least a good number of years yet.
Yeah.
I mean, the notion of going to Teams only for absolutely everything is probably not on a lot of people's radars, just because the infrastructure complexities.
Really?
So if you consider sort of like, I'll give you an example of retail. For instance, I used to work in a supermarket. We have a goods inwards office. It's got a cheap phone that's hooked to the gate to allow lorries in. There's no Cat5 to that system. So if you want to replace that with a Teams phone, you first have to upgrade your gate access system. You then have to put Cat5 cabling into that office. It's a lot of additional expense from just replacing the handset. So for a lot of organizations, the cheaper option, most efficient option to get to the end goal right now is to look at an interop or a hybrid solution.
Yeah. The one thing I will say, just to support Mark there, that I think hybrid is almost fundamental to any Teams deployment, mainly because the majority of customers are going to be using Skype for Business on premises. And as part of moving those workloads to the cloud, you simply need some form of hybrid topology to facilitate that. And that means effectively moving your identities, or at least syncing your hybrid identities from on-premises, from your Active Directory on-prem up into the cloud. And then you can obviously start licensing your users and lighting them up for workloads. So you need to have that Skype for Business Online and Skype for Business Server hybridity in place before you can start enabling users for Teams. So that's definitely core to
yeah, I think that hybrid will eventually take on a new, the name will still be around, but it'll take on a new meaning, because we have direct routing, we have on-premises SBCs that might be hooked into different SIP circuits, ISDN or other systems. That's just another form of hybrid. So hybrid is going to be very relevant to Teams, especially in places that can't be facilitated through Microsoft native calling plans.
Yeah, and to support them there as well, as Shawn I think mentioned earlier. You have to think about Teams as 4 different workloads. You have to think about the collaboration piece as its own thing. That's the one kind of uncommon denominator between Skype and Teams. Skype kind of promised collaboration but didn't really have it, whereas Teams has the whole notion of Teams channels, file access, and all the governance and everything around that is part of probably the biggest part of the planning.
Absolutely.
If you just think about the other 3 workloads, with messaging, that's an easy one to move, but it can't move unless voice moves. They're kind of tied together, which is kind of annoying in some respects, because to me, the messaging aspect of Teams is far superior to the basic messaging you get in Skype. Kind of more akin to more domestic tools like a WhatsApp and things like that. And yeah, so where I'm going with this is, the hybrid side of things is valid for organizations that just want to move one piece of that puzzle over the line to Teams. And typically what we do in our organization is move meetings. Whether or not the organization is using collaboration, because as I said, that does require a lot of planning, and a lot of organizations aren't ready for or don't think they're ready for the impact for the collaboration side. So meetings is the easiest one to move, and Microsoft coined the term meetings first, and for good reason, because meetings in Teams is far superior to what it ever was in Skype. The recording in the cloud and transcription, translation, and all that kind of stuff that comes with it. But so collaboration and the hybrid stepping stone there is very much valid, definitely for a meeting scenario. And if you want collaboration over the line, then yeah, you'll need that as well. And with the fringe and edge cases like contact center and recording, until they're mature enough to replace the Skype for Business equivalent in Teams, you'll need to have users, or at least some of the integration on the back end will require a Skype for Business server element to actually have that server integration for the recording and the contact center stuff. So hybrid, I think, will be around for a long time. And I guess it depends on the size of the organization. A few hundred users, it's easy enough to move most of those users over the space of, several months. Whereas, multi-thousands, sort of tens, 20,000 or even bigger, a particular multinational, you have to have a very, very controlled migration, which could take years, if not more.
That's a really interesting point there you just made. And most organizations, certainly sizable organizations, are going to have some element of contact center.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to maybe have remote branch offices in different countries under different regulations. So,
yeah.
That's a really interesting point you just made there, Andy. So let's just kind of move on to the next question then. And, more of the kind of final question for me would be, what does the future look like for Microsoft Teams? And what does it look like for Skype for Business? Are we going to see more parity between the two? Do we want to see more parity between the two? Or what's the game plan going forward looking into 2020? Mark, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. It's clearly obvious that Teams is the future. But that doesn't mean to say that Skype for Business is going away anytime soon. We still have Skype for Business Server 2019 for people who want to stay on premises for a number of reasons, whether that is because that's their strategy or because they simply can't move to Teams. Teams going forward, I think it's important to understand that the delivery cycle of applications has changed. So we're used to having a Skype for Business release every 3 or 4 years and then staged cumulative updates. With Teams, it's an evergreen product. So once you move your users to Teams, your job isn't done. Microsoft release and remove features on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. You've got to keep up to date with it. So the people need to change. By going to Teams, they need to change the way that they look at supporting and delivering cloud-based applications in a more agile, green, evergreen situation. And a lot of that is that takes time and investment as well from the business to keep up to date and evaluating those features. Will we see another Skype for Business server after 2019? I'd probably bet yes, just simply because there's so many cases out there that Teams probably won't fit right now or in the next sort of few years, but I could be proved wrong. Should you be moving away from Skype for Business because everyone else is to Teams? It depends on what your goal is and what your strategy is. If it makes sense to stay on-prem, stay on-prem. If it makes sense to move to the cloud, come on the journey with us to the cloud.
That's interesting. Shawn, life beyond server. Is there a Teams server? Is it going to be called something else? To accommodate these hybrid spaces. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever see Teams on premises. I mean, the architecture is just simply not built for that. It's fundamentally, born in the cloud, designed for the cloud. It's a microservice architecture that obviously leverages, a vast, amount of components from within Azure and from within, the Microsoft 365 service. So, I don't think we'll ever see it on premises. It is a bit of an interesting question, though, because Skype Business Online and Microsoft are saying is going away in July 2021. I mean, I suspect there might be some movement potentially on that date, but fundamentally that date does really drive, I guess, what your migration needs to look like. And I guess that's also why Microsoft have an expedited schedule for all those other use cases like, WVD, virtualized desktops, media offload, contact center, compliance call recording, and so on. So it's very important, I think, that we do get to a point where we do have feature parity with Skype Business Server, so that you can move those workloads, from on-premises to the cloud, because, like at Olympic, the cloud is the future. That's obviously the direction that Microsoft are going in. And you do have to follow the technology. Skype for Business Server, obviously, to Microsoft is kind of almost seen as legacy. I'm sure there is some future in it for some customers. Again, it is obviously entirely dependent on their use case. But Teams, yeah, is here to stay. So I think for most customers, they should be really dipping their toes in the product. Seeing what the collaboration and meeting capabilities are like, because those are the easiest, I think, to turn up, and then start adding to the product. When they've got that level of comfortability and readiness as well, business readiness.
Yeah, perfect. And Randy, over to you on this one. But you were talking about endpoints, and you were talking about gate phones and faxes and that kind of thing. And these spaces are always going to exist. These endpoints are always going to exist in organisations, but it's going to be a long time before they disappear. So, we might not call it a Skype for Business server in the future, but there's always going to have to be that kind of edge device, gateway, peripheral unit to bring those kind of hardware pieces and solutions into the Teams world. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you said that Teams isn't on-prem, and the server kind of back end and the microservices that deliver Teams and all the applications in the left rail aren't on-prem. But the genius of Teams, and I think it was a really great move in Microsoft's part, is direct routing. So with direct routing or routing, whichever way you want to pronounce it, you install a session border controller or a gateway somewhere in the organization, and you connect that to the Teams back-end platform to provide integration with stuff on-prem. So on-premise, it could be on-premises SIP trunks or ISDN lines while they're still around, but it could also be a legacy PBX. It could be an analog gateway. It could be a contact center solution. It could be a recording thing that's actually integrated with the SBC at the SIP level. So there's always that possibility of this. The direct routing is actually going to be there to actually enable the weird and wonderful lift phones. It's always going to be an analog device, or typically could be an analog device. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shawn and Mark. Whether a lift phone might be IP based. There probably are. Sort of door entry phones. There's vendors out that are working on door entry stuff, DECT and Wi-Fi phones and handsets and things like that. So there's a way to do it, but the direct routing piece is the genius behind it. With Skype for Business Online, if you wanted to connect to your on-prem world, you needed Skype for Business Server, whether it was a full-blown Skype for Business Server instance or whether it was their pseudo kind of lightweight version called Cloud Connector Edition, which I think people have only around this roundtable have only done a few times, and probably have some strong feelings one way or the other for it. But it was a bit clunky to say the least. To say that you can now light up a session border controller on-prem or in the public cloud in Azure, for instance. I've got 2 SBCs running in Azure. I'm sure Shawn has more than that. Mark probably as well. I've also got an SBC sitting next to me on a laptop on the shelf next to me that does direct routing into my own tenancy. So I could integrate with anything I want using that kind of direct routing piece. And I think that's potentially I don't know the future, but where we might be able to see things like you mentioned session border controllers. That's an area I think that could probably do with some investment on Microsoft's part, and I think the direct routing piece is a natural place to look at doing sort of high availability and different things by using those session border controllers and gateways to kind of leverage the on-prem world to lend itself to survivability for the cloud. So yeah, the future looks really, really good.
I mean, on the point of direct routing and SBC, there's a common misconception, I guess you can call it, that you deploy an SBC and you automatically got to connect that to some kind of PSTN connection. But with Teams and tackling those lift phones and those analog phones, you can deploy a SBC just to provide that interop between those systems and Microsoft Teams and still have PSTN calling delivered by calling plans in the cloud or by another direct routing service to your hosted telco provider somewhere in the world. So it goes beyond just connecting Teams to the PSTN. It also connects. You can use it as a standalone case to connect to your legacy infrastructure as well.
Yeah, I mean, the SBC, I mean, that's what we use for the migrations, right? We're moving from a legacy platform. The SBC obviously is core to that, and that's obviously how we do our inter-platform routings, so that users on legacy can call users on Teams and vice versa. So, I mean, everything really starts with the SBC. I think to the point that someone mentioned earlier, we're probably going to have to redefine what hybrid actually means in the context of Teams, because we've got all these different workloads and components that can run on premises. In fact, they can also run in public cloud as well, maybe as IaaS, if we're talking about maybe compliance as an example. But ultimately, that hybrid experience is going to be quite different to how it traditionally was done with Skype for Business Online. We mentioned obviously CCE there just a moment ago, but that experience kind of goes away, and now we're talking about having our workloads in different places, but ultimately all being connected back into Teams, just to provide different workloads.
Yeah, and there's no limit to the number of gateways and things that you can do. So you can have, one on-prem, you can have your resiliency in the cloud, you can have your, sort of start in the cloud and resiliency on-prem. You can have, as I said, a gateway for every site that needs analog devices or lift phones or fax machines or, whatever else. And all of that, that is, as far as I'm concerned, it's hybrid.
Yeah, and there's a huge vendor ecosystem, isn't there, out there to support Microsoft customers. As you said, SBCs, there's a number of vendors able to offer those SBC solutions, and there's endpoints and all sorts out there that I see in the Microsoft UC ecosystem. So lots of opportunities to be able to take you where you need to go smoothly, and ultimately to that kind of Teams destination. So this has been really interesting today. We're going to probably need to wrap this up now, but is there anything else anyone like to add, or should we call it a day at the...
Let's do it again. Let's do it again, because there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I think there's one point where we haven't talked about, and it goes back to what Randy's saying, is about moving meetings first to Teams. One key point of that step is how you tackle dialing conferencing, because by moving your meetings to Teams, you're now putting your dialing conferencing capabilities from what you had previously, which might be a great deal with your telco provider, to Microsoft, where you're paying a license fee to use that service. But since this month, I think actually Microsoft now limit the dial-out minutes to 60 minutes per license or audio conferencing license, and that could be a consideration before you make that meetings first jump, because that could end up maybe costing you just the same, if not a bit more, depending on what deal you've got on-prem.
It's one of a number of dependencies and considerations you need to make, and it's a moving feast. If you jumped on the Teams train 3 years ago, it was stopped at the platform. Now to move on to Teams, it's a moving train. You have to kind of grab onto that rail at the back of the train and hope you don't break your arm to get on. But once you're on, the job is just starting. But there's a number of things. Audio conferencing, I think, all you can eat with Teams, I think is an okay deal, and you can mix and match. So users can pay for the license, and you can have some users that don't use it often, just use the communication credits. So it's an interesting point, but there's a way around it, I think.
Yeah, there seems to be a solution for every scenario, which is great, especially for those larger enterprises, that do have those complexities, that legacy, and thousands of users that need to move over seamlessly. So, hey, thanks very much, guys. This has been really good. Hopefully, you'll be back again for another session on Microsoft Teams at some point. But I'd like to thank you, for your time today. Thanks to our viewers for watching, and I wish you all the best for 2020.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.